Even if you're an adult, even if you've been an adult for a long time, you're married with kids, if your parents don't give their blessing, then you're not honoring them. Biggest one is relationships, closeness in relationships with my family. That's been one of the biggest costs.
We believe in honoring our parents. We're Christians, but we don't believe honoring is the same as obedient. And to us, like, do you all want to come home and everyone to know that this show is canceled because of you?
Hey friends, it's Katie from Without a Crystal Ball. Welcome back to my channel. It is Monday, September 18th, 2023. Well, last week, Jill Duggar's book came out and it's been making a splash. Counting the Cost has been getting overwhelmingly positive feedback from so many people. Book reviews have been relatively positive. Those of you that are in my comments that have read it have said such great things about the book. You have expressed your, gratitude for her sharing her story, reveling in the strength that it must have taken her for her to write this book. A lot of you who grew up in this world, and specifically with whether you were in the IBLP or the IFB or other high control purity culture churches, you have seen a little bit of yourself in those books. And I will say there were things that she experienced in her childhood that I saw myself in. So I think her book does speak to the experiences specifically of a lot of young girls in a very patriarchal culture, especially a toxic patriarchal culture. That toxic patriarchal culture is evident in the fact that Jill's siblings are being very cagey about what they're saying about the book. Now, Jill Duggar just did an interview with Today, which I think will give you a better insight into Joyanna's recent video on YouTube where she claims she's no longer a part of the IBLP, where she doesn't teach her kids that kind of stuff, and claimed that she would read the book but said nothing bad about her dad, and in comments denied that her dad takes any of her money and denied that she, was bound by his, control, and that, that she was in some sort of NDA. She basically just said, I'm free, but said nothing about her dad. And then Jessa trying to claim that, no, my dad doesn't take my money, that's not true, and saying nothing about Jill's book. Well, now we're learning from Jill Duggar through an interview with Today that Jim Bob Duggar actually was part of a text message thread with his family where he threatened the entire family that if they spoke about anything related to this book and said anything disparaging about him or Michelle, they would be disinherited and cut off for good. So when you see a video by Jill or by Jessa or by any of these kids and they are publicly not condemning their father and they are not supporting Jill, that's why. So take everything you see with a very heavy grain of salt, because Joyanna is lying about her involvement in the IBLP. She's lying about her being free, and so is Jessa. So let's talk about this, along with the fact that Derek says that he actually threatened to take a protective order out against Jim Bob because he would not stop contacting his daughter. Before we dive into today's topic, can you please do me a big favor and give this video a thumbs up? Also, please subscribe to my channel if you have not yet subscribed by clicking on the subscribe button down below. Click on the bell so you can get notified of any time I go live or new content loads. And if you have something that you'd like to say, make sure to say it and share this video with your friends. Before I dive into this topic, even before, since I've asked you for all of that stuff, I just want to thank all of the people that grew up in the IBLP or with the Duggars or were in their home churches when all of this stuff was going on. To thank all of you guys that have reached out in the last few days. I have had so many people from the IBLP that have left the IBLP, that grew up with the Duggars, that were, privy to details of what was happening at that time, that have said that Jill's book has made them realize just how bad things were and how much they need to find their own voices in this process. And one of those people actually happens to be this woman that was one of the very first people to out the Duggars publicly. Remember several years ago, there was these elusive messages from a woman named Alice, and she had left these messages on a board, a forum in 2007, outlining all of the details about what Josh had done to his sister, who the Duggars really were, all the freebies they were getting, how Michelle was not a very hands-on mother. Alice left all these comments about how the Duggars had CPS involvement, how Jim Bob was hiding all of this from the public. They had actually recently filed a police report with Oprah, not them specifically, but they knew about that and how that had impacted the Duggars not being able to go on the Oprah show. That woman, well, she contacted me today. And while I'm not going to say her name publicly, she has never identified herself at all to another journalist, and said that she specifically reached out to me because she's been watching my content on the Duggars for years. And she said that Jill's book has finally given her the push and desire to share more about what she knows and use her voice too. So a couple things that Alice shared that I can tell you. I'm going to have a more in-depth conversation with her, and we'll see if I can actually get her to maybe do an interview. She's still debating whether or not she wants to publicly identify herself. But one thing that she did say is that the men in this church were so terrible to the girls, the young girls specifically, that when the stuff that Josh did to his sisters came out, it was not viewed as though the boys had done anything wrong, but rather the girls were blamed for it. So when a little girl was doing something, they were always blamed for, if the boy acted out against the girl, the little girls got the brunt of it. They must have done something in their behavior. They must have looked right, not looked right. They must have been wearing something. The boys were able to get away with whatever they wanted, and the girls just had to take it. And the men at this church, Alice said, were horrible. In fact, when girls were developing, these men were very hard on the girls, forcing them to bind themselves, wear baggy clothing, to not defraud the adults at church. Young minor girls forced to bind, to not defraud adults. That's the culture that Jill grew up in. That's not in the book, and that's the second person that's told me the story. I've actually spoken to one of the girls who was actually shamed in the same way that Alice told me about. So there's a lot of people that have been moved by Jill's book. And so I am so proud of all of you guys that are speaking out and saying things. It is so important that the truth be told. And if any of you need a place to share your story, please reach out. You can contact me at tips@withoutacrystalball.com. And I'm so grateful that a lot of you trust me with your information. So this article today that we're going to talk about has to do with an interview that Jill recently gave with Today Magazine. Now, I want to just preface this before I say this and say that Joyanna did a video, and she said that I'm not part of the IBLP and I'm going to read Jill's book. Yeah, that was it. She didn't say anything negative about her dad, nothing. Now, Joy is going to the Duggars church still a very fundamentalist Baptist, and hangs out with everyone else in the IBLP. So while she might say, no, I don't use the teachings, it's not just about the teachings, it's about the culture. And she is still in the culture of the IBLP. So is Austin. Now, when it comes to Jessa, same with her. And all of them have been threatened by Jim Bob. And Jill just revealed this today. So the bombshell dropped by Jill is said, her father lost it when he first heard about her writing this book. She said, after news broke that she was writing a book called Counting the Cost, her father responded by sending a message to the family. So remember, people were breaking it because we found the link on Simon & Schuster. Well, once that news broke, he sent a group text message including Jill and Derek. And she said, my dad texted the entire group text since we're still in the group thread. And he was just saying, this is so sad. And basically threatening that if anyone speaks out against him or my mom, that they would be cut out of the inheritance. So when Joy and Jessa and all of these kids won't speak out, it's because they want money. They want Jim Bob's money, and Jim Bob will cut them off. You know, I would rather have no inheritance than live in truth than have money once my father dies, and live in denial and help promote and enable what he does to his family. I also grew up in a Catholic, very, very conservative family, very not conservative politically, but like very patriarchal. And one of the biggest threats I always had growing up was, if you don't do this, you will be cut off. I don't care about that anymore. And Jill doesn't either, but some of her siblings do. But that's a real threat for some people, and it's very manipulative, it's psychological, it's horrible. So the Duggars have, their comments to the public have been this: we love all of our children very much. As with any family, few things are more painful than conflicts or problems among those you love. We've aimed to deal honorably with our children, our finances, and our endeavors. While imperfect, it is our intent and desire to live a life that honors Christ. We do not believe the best way to resolve conflicts, facilitate forgiveness and reconciliation, or to communicate through difficulties is through the media or in a public forum. So we will not comment. As the future unfolds, we will continue to love our family, pray for them, and enjoy every moment gifted to us to be parents and grandparents. I have to put that in there so their side is told. Now, Derick and Jill have been very, I would say, even though there's frustration here and even though there's hurt feelings, they have been very kind, and they haven't been direct. They're not being accusatory. They're not using inflammatory language. They're not calling names. They're literally just sharing their experiences. And when they keep talking about their relationship with their family, Jill continues to call it complicated. I mean, I would say it's complicated when your narcissistic father threatens anybody to say anything bad about him with disinheritance. And if you do this, I will do that. And these kids are so scared because they don't want to disobey their dad because they grew up in a culture where you obey no matter what, or damnation and hell is coming your way. And it's akin to witchcraft and rebellion, and, destruction's gonna come on. So this is what she said about the relationship. We have had to draw some very strict boundaries and put things in a healthier place. There hasn't been a whole lot of change. And again, we don't expect people to change. So while I love my parents and I respect them and honor them, I just have to prioritize our family unit and do what's best and healthy for Derick and I and our kids. Jim Bob at this point is not going to change. He's like, I think 57, 58 years old. He's a raging narcissist and megalomaniac and demigod. So I wouldn't expect him to change. So the best thing to do with a narcissist is boundaries. Now, expanding on the toxicness of the relationship and how bad it got, she said this: my relationship with my dad got pretty toxic to the point where we had to cut off individual contact with him. It got to the point where Derick was there to step in and kind of say, hey, don't reach out to my wife individually, or else I'll have to file a protective order, just because it was so hard for me to handle. Jim Bob is, and the men in this culture are known to stalk their wayward children. They are known to stalk them physically by showing up at their house, leaving threatening messages, having anonymous messages sent to them, using like burner accounts, following them, monitoring them, having other people follow them and monitor them. This is a very, very dangerous group of men that do not like their secrets getting out, and they will do just about anything to protect that. I've talked to so many girls that grew up in this culture that have literally been stalked and had to take out protective orders. So when Jill says this, believe her that it was very toxic. Derick expanded on this by saying Jim Bob knew that Jill was not in a bad way, but very emotional, very tenderhearted. And so he would play to that. And I'd ask, please don't contact her on her own one-on-one. And then he had done that again. And that's when I basically said, hey, if you can't abide by this boundary, because we're trying to do better setting boundaries, then I'll have to file a protective order. So Jim Bob is ignoring requests that I don't want you to contact me. Your contact is toxic. It is hurtful. It's not wanted. And even despite that request, is continuing to contact her. And he's singling her out because he knows how to push her buttons, and he's trying to manipulate and go and play at her emotions because he's psychologically trying to abuse her and get her back into the fold so that she stops telling the truth. It's sick. As far as a possible reconciliation, she says that they would have to see real change and not just settle for blanket apologies. She said, I think actual change would have to take place in some relationships. We really do hope for reconciliation, but also with some of my siblings and these relationships, I also realize that sometimes there's a need for space and time. And while we realize that life is short, we're also not going to be intimidated by that and pressured to have a false sense of healing, much like they did to her when she was a child and made her feel like it was her fault. like the men in those churches that told little girls, you defrauded a boy and that's why this happened to you. It's so sick what this culture does to these poor girls. And she said they say that attending therapy has helped them. And she said, we do love our family ultimately and would love for my kids to have their grandparents involved in their lives, but we also want to make sure that it's a healthy relationship. When you stop to think about the fact that the kids are in NDAs, that Jim Bob makes threats of, I'm going to cut you off if you say anything negative about me, and then you see videos and images from James Duggar saying, don't worry about me, it's all right. James showed up at her book signing over the weekend. You know, that just screams of Jim Bob sort of letting her know that they're watching her. Even though James loves his sister, he's very controlled by his dad. And then you've got Joy putting out a video saying, we're not in the IBLP, I'm free. And then you've got Jessa saying, my dad doesn't take my money. And then the truth is, he sent a text to the family and said, if you speak negatively about me or even speak about this book, you're disinherited. You won't be able to trust a thing these Duggars tell you. A thing. If I'm going to be honest with you, and I've told people this a million times, this channel is not a Duggar propaganda channel. I do not post tea about their babies and about, you know, the propaganda that they put out to deflect from the truth of what is going on. Because when we get sucked into the baby announcement, the gender reveals, and all of that, we're ignoring the damage that is being caused to real people in this culture. And so I, on this channel, focus on the truth. And the truth is, Jill is telling you the truth. People that grew up with the Duggars are telling you the truth. My sources are telling me the truth about what they experienced. Jim Bob does not want the truth out, but real change cannot happen without truth. And there will be no accountability for any of these men without truth. My hope that at some point in time, all of the men that have been involved in this culture, that have harmed their children, that have harmed women, and that have harmed children are held accountable. I hope the leaders of the IBLP are held accountable. I hope all of the people that have been hurt by this culture get vindication and justice for what they went through. And that doesn't happen when we talk about gender reveals and babies being born. We need to talk about the truth about what's happening in this cult. And when we talk about the gender reveals and the Q&As that they're doing, where they're talking about homeschooling, like Jessa just posted on her Instagram, ask me a question about, you know, homeschooling and parenting and this and that. Like, don't. That would be my opinion. Like, don't ask her a question. I don't want your advice, Jessa. What are you doing, Jessa, to actually change and to stop what's happening in your culture? If you're not doing anything, I don't care what you say, and I'm not going to report on what you say about it. Willingly admit that you're doing things to harm people, and then I might do a video on that. So what are your thoughts about this newest development with the threats of the protective order, with Jim Bob threatening to disinherit the kids? And what are your thoughts about the information from Alice? Like, I'm so impressed with Alice reaching out to me and telling me these details. It's been really shocking because I've had a couple girls that grew up in this church talk to me about the men at these churches being really, really, really hyper, like, aroused by the young girls, to the extent that a young girl developing was causing men to say that they were turned on. One girl was talking to me about how she was around 12 years old and just developed herself, and she was very busty for her age, and men were ogling her at church, grown men. That was the culture that the Duggar girls grew up in. Others are saying, my dad made me bind it so that men wouldn't feel tempted by me. There was never any, like, if you want to know why Josh Duggar is Josh Duggar, it's because men in this culture never get in trouble. They're never held responsible. My dream is that through Jill's book and through more awareness, that real justice can happen, real investigations can happen, and this disgusting, insidious cult can finally go down. Tell me what your thoughts are in the comments below. Bye, guys.